The house of moving statues. Moving into a new house is supposed to be exciting. A fresh start. A place to build memories. For us, it was different. Even now, years later, whenever I think about it, a deep unease settles in my chest. It was the kind of experience that makes you question reality, your own mind, and the very concept of safety. The only reason I'm sharing this now is that enough time has passed. I no longer feel like I'm at risk. Back then, my wife and I had just moved from the city to the suburbs. We had 3 kids, and our cramped apartment was suffocating. The new house was perfect, modest, but spacious. The neighborhood was quiet, safe, the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked. What really caught my wife's attention was the backyard. A beautiful yet slightly overgrown garden, scattered with old statues. They weren't normal garden ornaments. They were weathered, cracked, eerily lifelike. Some were angelic, others abstract, almost grotesque. They looked ancient, like relics from another time. My wife found them charming. I found them unsettling. But I wasn't about to start moving around dozens of heavy stone figures. If anything, it meant less yard work for me. So we left them as they were. The first sign. A few days after moving in, I was looking out the kitchen window when something felt off. One of the statues, an angel, I think, was facing away from the house. That was strange because I was pretty sure all of them had originally faced toward the house. But I had no proof, no memory clear enough to trust. So I let it go. Until the next morning. Another statue had turned. Now, I was certain something was wrong. I asked my wife, but she just shrugged and said she hadn't noticed. I suspected my son, Jimmy. He was a prankster. But when I questioned him, he gave me a confused look. That night, I barely slept. I kept waking up, convinced I heard something outside. The sound of stone scraping against stone. I told myself I was imagining it. But then, 3 days later, I looked out the window and my stomach dropped. All the statues had moved. They were now lined up at the very edge of the yard, backs facing the house. The sight was unnerving. It wasn't just the fact that they had moved, it was how they were positioned, like they were deliberately turned away from us. Like they were waiting. I stepped outside, heart pounding. I tried to lift one of them. It didn't budge. The statues were too heavy to move alone. There was no way a single person, or even a group of kids, could have done this overnight without making noise. My wife finally admitted it wasn't normal. She suggested it was some neighborhood prank, but that explanation felt hollow. We had met our neighbors. They were friendly, normal people. So who moved the statues? A warning. That night, I locked every door and window. I barely slept, constantly listening for footsteps, whispers, or scraping sounds. The next morning, everything was still. The statues hadn't moved again. For the first time in days, I felt relief. Then I stepped outside, and I saw it, spray-painted in massive black letters on the back wall of our house. Go away. I grabbed my son and rushed him inside. My wife gasped when she saw it, eyes wide with terror. I don't know what came over me, but a wave of pure rage exploded in my chest. I sprinted into the yard, yelling threats, daring whoever did this to show themselves. But there was no one. The backyard was silent. The realization sank in like a stone in my gut. Someone was watching us. Someone wanted us gone. We called the police. They took down a report but weren't exactly helpful. Probably just some local kids messing around, they said. I wanted to scream. This wasn't graffiti on a random wall. This was our home, and someone had invaded it. That night, I didn't just lock the doors, I barricaded them. The figures in the yard. 2 nights later, it got worse. My wife's terrified scream yanked me out of my thoughts. I ran into the living room. She was standing at the window, pointing outside. I followed her gaze. My blood ran cold. There were 5 people standing in our backyard. They weren't moving. They weren't speaking. They were just standing there, dressed in white clothing, their faces covered in blank, expressionless masks. Then, without warning, they started dancing. Not normal dancing. It was unnatural, jerky, puppet-like movements, as if their limbs were being yanked by invisible strings. The way their bodies contorted, the way they twisted and swayed, it was inhuman. My wife grabbed my arm. whispering in terror, "What the hell are they doing?" I didn't answer. I ran to the kitchen, grabbed the biggest knife we had, and stormed toward the back door. I flung it open and charged at them, screaming like a madman. They froze. For a few horrible seconds, they just stood there, staring at me through their blank white masks. Then, all at once, they turned and ran, disappearing into the trees behind the garden. By the time the police arrived, they were gone. The aftermath, that was the final straw. I didn't care how much it cost. I installed security cameras the very next morning. My wife begged me to move, but I told her we couldn't afford it. I promised her, if anything else happens, we'll leave. But nothing else ever did. Whoever they were, they never came back. The statues never moved again. The house became quiet. And yet, the scariest part? We still live here, and we never got an explanation for what happened.